Earlier this week, Canada and the other G7 countries committed to making deep cuts to carbon emissions by 2050 and by 2100, an end to all fossil fuel use. Environmental groups were quick to trumpet the announcement as a major victory. But even if this group dramatically reduced emissions, would it make a difference? What would its impact really be? Canadian geographer and climatologist Dr. Tim Ball joins me now on Skype. Dr. Ball, let me start with your initial reactions to this 85-year pledge.
It's a farce, and the only reason that climate change is on the agenda is because it's Obama's piece of legislature that he's making both his domestic and his foreign policy centerpiece. And the reality is that most of them at that conference are wearing what I call the cloak of green. They're pretending to look green and caring about climate change, but most of them, like our own Prime Minister Harper, knows underneath the science just doesn't justify it. So what's going on there is a great propaganda piece because that's what Obama wants. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the two biggest users combined of our producers of CO2 and burning of fossil fuel, China and India, they're not even involved.
Well, when you consider the large emitters, China and India, as you mentioned, do you think they have any intentions of reducing their carbon emissions? I mean, conveniently, they weren't invited to the G7 conference.
No, they have no intention, and they've already stated so. I mean, China signed that phony deal with Obama. When you look at it, it says absolutely nothing, and the Chinese are very good at that, at making things look, it's like the Chinese circus. It looks so simple on the surface, but underneath, there's all sorts of things going on. India has announced that they're not going to cut back, and Japan has announced they're going to build 40 more coal-burning plants in the next 7 years. So it's an absolute farce. But that's, as I said, it's all about Obama's legacy, and that's what they're pushing.
You know, even if we were to believe what the 98% of scientists say, which is climate change is a big problem and the world is going to, be devastated in just a couple of years, Canada is a bit player in this. Our carbon emissions are so minor. Could anything we do actually impact that?
No, and in fact, anything anybody could do. And by the way, the 98%, of course, is back to that consensus argument. The truth is 98% of the scientists that are saying that don't know what they're talking about. But no, in fact, if you go back and look at the original Kyoto Protocol, which is where this thing went global, they admitted at the time that if the complete protocol as originally set out was introduced, nobody would be able to measure the difference in CO2 in the atmosphere. That's how small the total human contribution is, not just Canada's contribution. And so it's all a political process about control. And of course, what you need is a global issue that transcends national boundaries and that allows you to then bring in global carbon taxes and so on. So what any individual country does, even if China stopped producing, nobody would be able to measure the difference in the CO2 going into the atmosphere.
And of course, the leaders agreed in 2009 at Copenhagen that they would pour $100 billion into trying to reduce climate change around the world. I know that Angela Merkel brought that back up at the G7 summit earlier this week. Is it just, what are they doing with this money?
Well, of course, that's part of the scam. The money's going to a bank in South Korea. And I think Canada put in, $300 million or something. And of course, what's laughable about that is because in the original agreement, China was declared to be, not a non-producer, but a small producer. And China was therefore going to receive money from that green fund. And now they've come out, China came out just recently and said, hey, we want our $100 billion. Where is it? And yet they're the biggest producer now. And so the whole thing is beyond farcical. It's almost criminal now because of the damage it's doing to economies and people's lives. And that green fund is part of that.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Ball, final question. What do you make of Stephen Harper seemingly, albeit begrudgingly, going along with this?
Well, as I said earlier about the cloak of green, I know from various sources that his office knows the science of it. And one of the things that you see he's doing underneath his cloak of green is eliminating funding to Environment Canada. And of course, Environment Canada has been the big pusher of the climate change issue in Canada. And that was deliberate. When they set up the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was done through the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, which meant then they controlled the bureaucrats in every weather office around the world. And Environment Canada, in fact, Gordon McBean, who was an assistant deputy minister at the time, chaired the founding meeting of the IPCC in Villach, Austria in 1985. So Harper's struggling to control his bureaucrats at Environment Canada, and that's his challenge. But of course, all of the politicians know that the minute they come out against anything like that, such as cutting the funding, and you see the Environment Canada scientists out there saying, oh, the Harper's office is trying to muzzle us. And it's absolute nonsense. They're bureaucrats. They're not supposed to speak publicly. But of course, they're the ones that are pushing this agenda. And that's the challenge. But no politician at this point is prepared to stand up and say no. The only one, as you and I know, is Senator Inhofe in the United States.
I'm afraid you may be right, Dr. Ball, but that's all the time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very kindly.